Trudy. No. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Yes. So it's always a pleasure to welcome you, both veterans and newcomers, to University for a Day. Well, it is not literally our first program of the season. It is the Schemmel Forum's first and foremost signature event. It speaks to our aim of bringing to the university and this community a kind of immersion in excellence, an opportunity to feast on ideas and issues on a wide variety of topics and savor the delights of this very rich but non-caloric fare. This opportunity, I hasten to add, is made possible at a very reasonable cost to all of us because of the generous contributions of the PNC Bank and the Scranton Area Foundation. We're most grateful for their support. Our informal, unwritten constitution, if I may take the liberties with that term, Akil, yeah? I mean our unwritten theme for today's deliberations is America and the world. That is broad enough to mean anything, but the anything we mean is not intended to be self-referential, but rather to ground us, to acknowledge the vantage point from which we view the world. We begin with examining our undeniably important, albeit changing, position in the geopolitical world, then move on to our Constitution and what it might or should look like in the future, then plunge into the depths of corruption and greed traced from antiquity to our time, and then to project out, or we might say escape, from this nation and from this planet to an exploration of what might be going on in the far reaches of the universe. After each lecture, there'll be ample time for Q&A, and after Akil's lecture and before lunch, there will be a book signing. You'll note in your packets that there is an evaluation form. We urge you to fill it out and return it to us before you leave today. I was going to say that, the penalty would be you couldn't get your drink at the reception, but I've decided against that. It's an ambitious journey we're about to embark on, so welcome all and fasten your seatbelts. We start with the, yes, deliberately self-referential subject of America's role in a changing world. We are living in a time of radical and rapid change. We can barely catch up with ourselves or grasp the daily news. We are irrevocably and intricately involved in this increasingly interdependent world, and from day to day we wonder just what our status is in connection with other nations. The recent murder of our ambassador in Libya is a personal, national, and international tragedy that speaks to today's topic in an all too vivid way, as does the continuation of violence prompted by the circulation of the American-made film that portrays the Muslim prophet Muhammad in a compromised way. We couldn't have asked a better person to lead us through this puzzling and upsetting morass than this morning's first speaker, Trudy Rubin. Trudy, the prize-winning, internationally renowned foreign correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer, has focused much of her attention in the past few years on what is arguably the most troubling and complex area in the world, the Middle East. She spent a good deal of time in the region of Afghanistan, Iraq, Egypt, Syria, during the post-Arab Spring era, and will be sharing her observations and informed opinions about the situation in those places and how our nation fits into the picture as the world turns, for better and for worse. Trudy has graced our Schemmel Forum podia before, always to our advantage, and was kind enough to leave Philadelphia at an ungodly hour to give us a wake-up call about America's role in the changing world. So please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming out early in the morning. I tend to see things through a Middle East-centric focus, and needless to say, I've been very focused on what's been going on this past week in the region, and I've written a column for the Sunday paper tomorrow, Inquirer, on 6 things you should know to understand why this happened and what we should do about it. But let me try to fit what happened in the Middle East into the broader topic that I'm supposed to talk about this morning, which generally is as new powers arise in the world and budgets decrease, how can the U.S. still exert influence abroad? And I can talk more in detail on what I think is happening in the Middle East and how we should look at it in the question period, if you so desire. You know, all of us are aware in this time of budget obsession and questions about how involved the U.S. should be abroad, that the nature of U.S. influence is shifting. The unipolar moment that got so much attention, 15 years ago, the talk about the end of history, all this has vanished like a newspaper headline that's been tossed in the rubbish. You've also, I'm sure, all read articles, if not books, about the rise of the rest, the BRIC powers, Brazil, Russia, India, China, the new influence of these regional giants, such as Brazil or Turkey or perhaps Iran, and the diminishment of U.S. influence. I endorse the school of thought that says right now the rest are fine, but none of them have achieved superpower status. The U.S. is in question mark mode. Do we want to exert influence abroad? Can we? And while we're in question mark mode and the world is changing, there's a big question mark over superpowerdom. And right now, there's a vacuum in a lot of regions, and it's not clear who is going to be the dominant power regionally and what role the U.S. will eventually play abroad. But let me just talk about what happened last week in the Middle East as an example of how U.S. power and influence has changed and basically diminished. First of all, the Middle East. With the end of the Cold War, which affects everything that I've just said, the neat alignment of two superpowers, which were like magnets, half the world, drawn to one, half to the other, that's gone. It made it so simple. In the Middle East, you knew which country was aligned with whom. And we had power in the countries that were not aligned with the Soviet Union. The number of those kept dropping. And to get a sense of how far we've come from those days, look at Russia trying to maintain its influence in Syria from the old Cold War days. It's sort of pathetic. Russia used to have an embassy in Syria. I visited it in the old days. That was the size of a huge city block, bristling with equipment. When the Soviet Union fell, that embassy became a ghost town. I was in it afterwards, and it was basically empty. And so Russia's just trying to hold on to its last ally in the region and to a little fueling station where it has rights on the coast of Syria in Tartus. But the days of a neat superpower breakdown in the region are long gone. Now, if you look back to the Gulf War in 1991, I really think that was sort of the apex of U.S. power. We went in, we won a conventional war. We used shock and awe because we were fighting in the desert where our kinds of troops and airplanes had total mastery. The war was over quickly. No one had any doubts who won. We mustered an international coalition. The UN was behind us. It wasn't the most important thing, but it was significant. And those days are over. Then comes the Iraq War of 2003. And I think no one should underestimate how our influence in the Middle East, and to a certain extent in the world, was affected by the disasters and the mismanagement and the misunderstandings and the willful blindness that went into that war. Not to revisit that in any detail, but basically the world saw a picture of U.S. incompetence, which tremendously shook and astonished Arabs in the region, especially in Iraq. In all the visits I made to Iraq from 2002, I haven't been there since a year and a half ago, but over and over again in the initial years, people would ask me, in astonishment, what is the U.S. trying to do? Are they deliberately stoking chaos so that you can stay here forever? Because people could not grasp that the technologically superior superpower could not manage to turn on the electricity in Baghdad, could not manage to get Iraqi oil production going, could not manage to keep an insurgency from arising. And as they watched that, they only had two explanations. Either, as the conspiracy theory went, there was some secret plot and we were doing it deliberately, or, more astonishing, the United States just couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle the Middle East. They couldn't handle militants. They were incompetent. And, the fact that that war basically made Iraq a satellite of Iran, the fact that we mismanaged, could not handle that aftermath, and to bring it up to the present, to Obama, the fact that we pulled out and basically have lost all influence in that country has left people in the region thinking that either we do not or we are incapable of exerting our power in the Middle East. You just have to look at what's going on in Iraq now, where we were, under President Obama, we were unable to negotiate a follow-on agreement to keep a small troop presence in Iraq, which Obama did want to do, but his negotiator totally muffed it. And where we left behind an enormous embassy that goes on for what would be blocks and blocks. It runs along the river and is like a small city. And this was supposed to implement a strategic framework accord that was going to involve us in training all manner of departments and ministries in Iraq, and exchanges and promoting democracy. Already we're planning to cut that embassy in half. It was 17,000 people were there in terms of support people and diplomats, about 1,000. Already the plan is to cut it in half, and I will guarantee you it's going to be cut in half again and then in half again. And most of that embassy will probably be turned over to the Iraqi government at some point. And in a way, that's symbolic of our receding influence in the region. So the image of incompetence. Throw into that the end of the peace process, and I believe the peace process is over. There's lots of blame to go around, not least to Israelis and Palestinians, to the Bush administration, the Obama administration. But the bottom line is the U.S. influence in the region, not to the greater extent, but to a certain extent, was a consequence of the power that we were seen to have as a mediator that could talk to both Israelis and Palestinians. With the end of that process and the perception that the U.S. has abandoned it or was incapable of advancing it, that also diminishes our power in the region, and again gives an image of the United States unable to exert the leverage on local groups, movements, governments that it used to have. Then we fast forward to the Arab Spring. Some people now are trying to create a narrative that says the Arab Spring is a result of President Obama's mistakes and that we should have kept dictators in power. Again, I think this totally misunderstands what power we do and do not have in the world today. We have passed the moment when the United States could maintain dictators in power. Can you hear me when I'm talking? Why don't I just keep talking?
He needs the mic for
Oh.
he's taping it, though.
I hope this isn't going to keep happening.
See if it works now.
Can we please not do this?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Can we get rid of the screen?
The screen will stay on until it goes black. It goes, but the mic's on.
With the end of the Cold War, the ability to maintain dictatorships as surrogates for the two superpowers really went down the drain, and the Arab Spring is the consequence of forces within those countries that the United States could not have stopped had it wanted to. I mean, after all, when the demonstrators gathered in Tahrir Square, the Egyptian military had a choice. It could have mowed them down, or, as happened, it backed off. That was because the military was old, tired, and as we recently saw, the elderly generals simply gave way to the Muslim Brotherhood when everyone thought that they would continue to confront the Brotherhood. And that's because the older ones had lost steam, especially after their buddy Mubarak fell, and the younger ones decided it was better for them to make a deal. That was not something that we could have controlled. The same with Tunisia, which nobody expected and was over before anyone even really understood what was happening. Yes, in Libya, there was a choice. And now some revisionists are saying, you know, why did we overthrow Gaddafi? We didn't overthrow Gaddafi. The country was in chaos. Perhaps it would have split and a civil war, tribal war would have continued. In the end, Gaddafi would have gone. So this was a historic process, and still is ongoing, that is beyond the ability of the United States or any other power to control. You see Moscow trying desperately to hold on to its man Assad. And out of Moscow, in the past week, after the ambassador Stevens was killed in Libya, there were these very unseemly calls of "I told you so." And when you look at what was being written in the Russian press, think tank heads and analysts close to the Kremlin were all saying, you see, we told you. You should have held on to stability, and you should hold on to Assad because you see, what's the alternative? Do you really think you're going to get democracy in the Middle East? Are you kidding yourselves? Well, in theory, the Russians are right. It would be easier to have dictatorships in the region now, like the old days where you could rely on your allies. But what Putin doesn't understand is that there are processes going on that are not turned on and off like a faucet. What's happening in Syria ultimately will lead to the fall of Assad, and they can't prevent it. The United States might be able to expedite it if we gave arms to some of the rebels, but that doesn't mean that anyone is going to get a friendly government in the end, not Russia nor the United States, because what is going on in the region is a process that is no longer within the control of superpowers, one, the other, or both. So the Arab Spring, again, is an illustration of the diminishment of U.S. power as structures that lasted for so long after World War II because of the superpower balance continue to crack up. Now, again, when one is talking about the diminishment of U.S. power in the region, I'd have to add to all of these historic factors and errors of commission or omission by the United States that at this point in time, because the situation is so complicated, President Obama has often made statements, put himself out on a limb, and then hesitated on Iran, on Syria. And so truly there is a perception of U.S. inconsistency, an uncertainty of when the U.S. will act, when it won't act, and a lack of clarity about whether the United States supports democracy or doesn't support democracy. President Obama has taken a strong position saying Assad should fall, but has really done nothing to expedite that. And so that also creates the perception that at this point the United States is all about talk and not about action. Now, you can debate whether or not the United States should become involved at all in Syria, but when you talk big and carry a twig, that also gives an image to the rest of the world that the United States is no longer interested in getting involved in these kinds of struggles, and that contributes to the diminishment of U.S. Reputation, and in a sense it's circular because it undercuts U.S. power when there is the perception of uncertainty. Then groups operate with total disregard for what they think the United States might or might not do. And they test the United States. Now, if you're looking at the Middle East, so you say, okay, the U.S. is pulling back. The U.S. position is unclear. What about these new rising powers that we're talking about? And I think one of the most interesting things in the Middle East today is, you know what, these new rising powers, the BRIC powers, China, well, you know, China is not interested in getting involved, but indirectly it is. They are not influencing the situation either. And so, in a sense, there is a power vacuum. And I think you can see this replicated around the world. All right, take the Middle East. Take Syria. Russia is trying to hold on to the Cold War days and its role as a Middle East power. This is an illusion, and in the end, Russia will lose out. Iran is trying to assert its role as a new rising regional power. Sorry, it's not going to work. Iran was advertising itself as the leader of all Muslims, but Iran is a Shiite power, and now Iran is seen by the Sunni Arab world as totally complicit in the slaughter of Sunnis in Syria. And so the reputation of Ahmadinejad, who was the hero for a while of the Arab street, has gone straight down as the images come over YouTube of bombs being dropped on civilians and the mutilated, tortured bodies of Sunni youths in Syria. Brazil tried, and Turkey, the neighbor of Syria. Turkey tried to become the new Ottoman power in the region. It was supposedly the story of the last 5 years. And the Turkish policy was no quarrels with our neighbors. Prime Minister Erdogan tried to set himself up as the man who would negotiate with the help of his brilliant foreign minister, Mr. Davutoglu. They would negotiate peace in all the conflicts in the countries around them and become the new dominant power in the region, in a sense, competing with Iran. This policy has fallen to shreds. Turkey, which had tried to mediate between Assad and the rebels, Erdogan had personally tried to intervene. Foreign Minister Davutoglu traveled repeatedly to see President Assad, and Assad ignored them and just started slaughtering the rebels. And so Erdogan, who's an emotional man, got furious at Assad, now calls for his overthrow, plays host to the Syrian opposition, but is afraid to go further without United States leadership. Turkey privately is saying to the U.S., we are in NATO, you are in NATO. If you want to get rid of Assad, you will cooperate, but not unless you're in the lead role. The United States pulls back, Turkey is hesitating, and the war in Syria goes on. Brazil tried to get involved in the Middle East game. Brazil and Turkey together sent leaders emissaries to Tehran to try to become the mediator who would negotiate a solution for limits on Iran's nuclear program. The United States felt that they were diddled, that what they came back with was inadequate, and ignored it. So Turkey and Brazil failed to become the big savior in the Middle East, and the United States doesn't have an agreement there either. So what you see is, if the United States doesn't play a major role, these regional powers on their own do not seem to be able to come in to fill the vacuum. China's role in the Syrian crisis has simply been as a naysayer. Like the Russians, they are unhappy when dictators are threatened by popular revolts. So China's role in Syria, along with Russia's, is simply to cast a veto in the United Nations if there's any attempt to get a multilateral effort to support military action against Assad. But this isn't very satisfactory, because if there's no multilateral solution, there could be an Israeli bombing of Iran, which would lead to the closing of the Persian Gulf. China is a major oil consumer, so China has major interests in the Middle East, but it is unable to exert any kind of a global leadership role that would help bring a solution to the Iranian problem, to the Syrian problem. So you have a situation where you have the rise of the rest, but none of them are really in position to do something global that would elevate them to a leadership role primus inter pares. And where the United States is pulling back, the vacuum exists and conflicts fester. Let me just say a little bit more about the perception of the United States abroad and throw out a few ideas about how I think the United States should exert its somewhat diminished role in the world. And then I will stop and take questions, because I think there's a lot to say about the Middle East and other areas, and you might want to ask me specifics. In looking at what role the U.S. can and should play going forward, I can't say enough about how the economic crisis of 2008 and the political paralysis in the United States since then has affected our image abroad. When the economic crunch happened in 2008, it destroyed the myth, perhaps, or the widespread idea globally that even if the United States had muffed up in Iraq, even if the United States was not doing so well in Afghanistan, the United States was still the economic model to emulate. And I can't emphasize how important that concept was, because the United States was still seen as the economic system that was most successful globally, and as the model that other countries should try to copy. Since that crash, the whole idea of Washington as the economic model has simply cracked. And the reason that is so important is because what happens now is that developing countries who might have looked to the U.S. Because they need trade, because they need aid, because they need technical assistance, are now casting their eyes around and trying to find somewhere else that might fill the role that the United States once played, especially if our economic situation causes us to shrink our aid budget and pull away from development assistance, also because we failed so miserably at development assistance in Iraq and Afghanistan, that may also cause us to pull back. But for other countries, that leaves them asking, all right, who is the model now? Needless to say, many are looking at the more statist model of China. China seems to be the economic success story of the decade, of the past 2 decades. But the interesting thing is that when you look at the way China gives economic aid, it is very, very self-interested. And I think many developing countries are gradually going to get fed up with it, even if it serves their needs. I mean, for example, in Afghanistan, where I've seen it up close, China will come in and say they will build a road. They will build a road because it goes to a mine that they want to get a contract to exploit. Well, you'll say, okay, this is very clever, but they will use only Chinese labor. They will set up whole Chinese work camps, Chinese cooks, Chinese everything, Chinese truckers. They will give a few Afghans jobs sweeping on the side of the road, but all the work is done by Chinese. There is absolutely no concern for health, safety, what have you. And some countries are beginning to notice this, even though Chinese help with infrastructure is much in demand. But also Chinese terms are tough. They are not giving charity. And I am not sure that the countries who are turning to China are going to find what they are seeking. But in the meantime, the fact that more countries are looking to China indicates the fact that they think the United States is pulling back. So just to summarize, we have a situation where after the Cold War, the easy ability to line up allies diminished. We have a situation where historical forces were then unleashed, which are bringing changes to parts of the world like the Middle East that the U.S. cannot control and are very hard to manage. And the fall of dictators unleashes popular anger, anger that's stirred up as much by corruption and economic disaster at home as by anything else, but can be easily transferred to anti-Americanism by radicals who choose to stir that up. And we have hesitation on our part. Born of economic crisis, born of political paralysis, born of uncertainty about how much we want to become involved. And that creates a circular flow whereby other countries see our hesitation, our uncertainty, our ambivalences, and are not sure that the United States anymore is a power on whom they can rely. Bringing us up to the present, so what then can or should the next president do, whether it's Obama or Romney? I hate to even talk about it that way. Frankly speaking, I find Obama's foreign policy very disappointing, and Romney's purported foreign policy very frightening. So, you know, you have to choose here. I think people are confused about what the United States stands for now. It's very hard to be consistent in this new world. For example, you know, in the Middle East, do we stand for democracy even if it brings Islamists into power? Should we intervene to help rebels if we support human rights and democracy? It's hard to be consistent, I grant you that. But I do think that whoever becomes president, whether it's Obama in his second term or Romney in his first, has to be more consistent than we have been up until now. I think in private, the next president has to develop some red lines, not in public, for Islamic governments that are likely to take power in the Middle East region. I think there have to be red lines about protecting our people, protecting our embassies, and there has to be action taken if they fail. These governments will try to have it both ways. As in Egypt, they claim they can't control their radicals. Then their radicals trash U.S. interests, and they say, oh, but we're the centrists and we have to protect against the radical flank. It can't work like that. There has to be some cost, even if it involves cutting aid. This is a two-edged sword. You want to help these new democracies, but you cannot simply pay money to governments that absolutely ignore U.S. interests and permit groups to kill or pillage American facilities. So I think there have to be private red lines. I think we have to decide, do we support democracy or don't we, and be consistent. I think we have to decide where we have military interests, narrow that down, but when we do, be clear on what we will do and won't do. I haven't talked at all about China, but the United States under President Obama has taken a very, very public position that we want to remain a Pacific power. I think that's correct. But I think if you take that position and you indicate to Southeast Asian nations and to Japan that you want to help them stand up to a rising Chinese power, not confront it, not go into military clashes, but stand up in the sense that you make clear you will not be rolled over by a rising Chinese power. If you take that position, and the Obama administration has, then I think you have to act on it. And you have to clarify privately to the Chinese, not publicly, what the red lines are. And you have to work actively to get Southeast Asian nations to unite and stand up, not aggressively, but just factually to China, so China knows that there are costs for aggressive expansionism. If you don't want to play that role, then don't publicly take those positions. Now you see quotes coming out of the administration about, well, we don't want to fight over rocks. Well, rocks are islands that the Philippines and Japan claim to have rights to, under which are natural resources. So the U.S. cannot publicly take positions and then act as if those words were never uttered. We have to pick where we will take a stance, but if we put ourselves out there, I think we have to follow up. Most of all, I think two things: that we have to get our economic and political house in order. This is the bottom line, because foreign countries, including our NATO allies, look at us. And by the way, the idea of a pivot to China and ignoring Europe and the Middle East is ridiculous. Both are going to be there, and both are going to be areas where we have to pay attention. But we have to get our economic and political house in order, because nobody will respect us and nobody will look to us if we are paralyzed at home and our economy continues to lag. And finally, I think we have to approach this new world where American power is still there, but is diminished both in actuality and in perception. We have to approach it with no illusions. President Obama came to office assuming that goodwill would suffice and good deeds would be appreciated. In today's world, you know, that's simply not the case. Goodwill is not enough in the Middle East, for example. When Obama went to Cairo in 2009 and talked about a new day between Muslims and the United States, goodwill is not enough in an era where all kinds of old grievances are bubbling up, where dictators are gone, where radicals appeal to populist sentiment and youth bulge that is angry about corruption and unemployment can easily be convinced that that anger should be transferred to America. Goodwill is not enough, and we have to be aware of that, and we can't expect gratitude when we help other nations. We have to, I think, fall back on the idea that we do things because either they are morally correct or they're in our interest, but don't always expect people to say thank you, and don't think that talking is enough. And finally, I think that we have to prepare for certain risks that we may not be able to avoid. In my mind, the greatest threat today to U.S. security down the road lies in Pakistan, not in Iran. I think we have to be careful about analyzing where our threats lie. I don't know what the solution is to Pakistan, but Pakistan is a country with nuclear weapons, with a 57% literacy rate, with a third of children who never go to school at all, with 91 million youths under the age of 21, most of them unemployed or underemployed, and with terrorist groups internally that are eating away at the fabric of the country and the fabric of the Pakistani military. I think there is where terrorism down the line might marry nuclear weapons, not Iran. I think we need to pick the countries that are the most threatening or the issues. We have to be very astute and very careful. Our power is diminished, but we still have power. But in this age where our power is not what we used to be, we have to be very clever in analyzing how and where that power should be used. And I'll stop there. Questions? Yes.
Where do you think, could you identify where some talent lies that could influence the next president? Well, you do.
No, yeah, right. It's actually, I don't know if you all heard the question, which was, could I identify where some talent lies that could influence the next president? It really is a very good question, because I think that one of President Obama's weak points has been in the people he has chosen for his international security team. And the talk, should he win again, the talk is that the next Secretary of State might be Senator John Kerry or might be UN Ambassador Susan Rice. My guess is if the Senate is close, there will be a reluctance to give up another Democratic seat. Even in Massachusetts, we know that Massachusetts now is no shoo-in for a Democrat. And so that might lead to the appointment of Susan Rice as Secretary of State. I think that would be a very big mistake. I don't think she is up to the job. And I also think that Obama has picked his national security team more for their finger on the domestic political pulse than for their knowledge and astuteness about foreign policy. Tom Donilon, the National Security Advisor, is basically a political operative. Dennis McDonough, his deputy, is also was he was an aide to Senator Tom Daschle, whose main interest was healthcare, not foreign affairs, and so. On the Obama side, it's a really good question. I have been trying to think who should replace Hillary Clinton, and equally important, who will stay on as National Security Advisor. And it's a search. I mean, a lot of the old faces have passed on, not necessarily died, but, gone into other things, are no longer in government, not available. There's not an obvious bench, and I'm thinking more about that. On the Romney side, there are some awful people in the entourage. And the head of his foreign policy transition team, Robert Zoellick, is a pretty good guy. He's very conservative but level-headed, the former head of the World Bank. One could do a lot worse than having him as Secretary of State. However, some of the people around Romney, like John Bolton, the former ambassador to the United Nations, who was hot for a war with Iran, Dan Senior, who is his, at this point, major advisor on the Middle East, who was the mouthpiece for Paul Bremer in Iraq, mouthing off idiotic platitudes about how wonderful things were going, and calling out anyone who wrote the truth as traitors. It's not confidence making. So with Romney, there are people who are realists in the Republican circles, but whether he would pick them, I can't say.
What kind of marks do you give for Hillary?
Excuse me, could you use the microphone?
What kind of marks do you give Hillary as secretary, and what influence has she had on our foreign policies?
That's also an interesting question, marks for Hillary and what kind of influence she has had. Because Hillary is so smart and because she has such star quality, I think one often tends to rate her on that rather than on what she has actually been able to achieve. Obama is basically his own foreign secretary. I mean, he makes his policy, I think, more than, some presidents have relied more on secretaries of state, some have relied more on national security advisors, some hold foreign policy close to their chest. I think to a large extent that has been Obama's tack. Hillary Clinton, in an effort to offset the power of personal friends in the National Security Council that always had Obama's ear, because the people like Dennis McDonough on the National Security Council were with him on his campaign team and have always been close to him. So in order to try to counter that, she appointed special emissaries, George Mitchell to the Middle East, Dick Holbrooke to Afghanistan and Pakistan. If you look at the track record, those special emissaries failed. And, there were lots of reasons for that, not enough time to go into them, but basically, her signature efforts to put a stamp on those regional policies have not bred success. And in reality, I mean, Afghanistan, which also is Obama's signature issue, is going very badly. And we are headed for a pullout that, at this point, looks likely to collapse Afghanistan into civil war, which, and this is the most dangerous part of it, will have a blowback on Pakistan. And so, I'm getting, this is a tangent, but I'll just finish the thought. The Pakistanis are busy committing suicide, and we haven't been able to figure out how to stop them. But basically, the Pakistani military and intelligence agencies have been unwilling to let go of their Taliban proxy because they think we're going to pull out, everything's going to collapse, and they want their guys in power in Kabul. So they've let the Afghan Taliban have a safe haven in Pakistan. What's happened now, as the United States is pulling troops out of eastern Afghanistan, is that the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban are married, and so have become married. So as we pull out, the Pakistani Taliban, who want to overthrow the government of Pakistan, are moving their safe haven into Afghanistan, where the Pakistani army can't get them. And then they go back and forth. So as we pull out of Pakistan, if there's no political solution there, and it doesn't look like one is likely, we're going to have a situation where Pakistan is more in jeopardy with its nuclear weapons, where there's civil war in Afghanistan, allowing jihadis to take up residence again, not in big bases like al-Qaeda had, but in smaller groups. It's going to be a very dangerous situation. And I think the whole effort that Hillary tried to spearhead with Holbrooke, who wanted to get negotiations going with the Taliban, yada, yada, that came to naught, and it had really come to naught before Holbrooke died. So I don't know, when the history books are written, whether she is going to get very high marks for having had an impact on resolving issues or structuring policy in a way that achieved results. Yes. Oh.
What do you see happening in Saudi Arabia? You haven't mentioned that. It'd be interesting to know your thoughts.
Well, yeah, I mean, here's another time bomb down the road. The King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia is the best we are going to see. The problem is he's in his late 80s. This is a man who has some vision. He is a man who has tried within the constraints of the system that his forebears have built up, and which I'm sure he subscribes to. He has tried to liberalize things slightly for women. He, in 2002, put forward a peace plan, which I think history will record that it was a tragedy, was never really taken up, the Arab Initiative for Peace between Israel and the Palestinians. So I think this is a far-sighted man, but his days are numbered, and after him, the deluge. The first the crown prince, the titular crown prince just mercifully died because Prince Nayef, a top security official, was a man who totally believed in conspiracy theories, and for several years after 9/11 was still insisting that no Saudis had been involved. So Nayef is dead, but the current crown prince is corrupt and totally, Abdullah is not corrupt personally. The current successor is corrupt and simply not up to what he is going to face. You know, the Saudis are an enormous part of the problem in the region. I think that Abdullah realizes that, but I don't know how they pedal back. I'll just throw out one factoid that I think is fascinating. Private Saudi money is funding a lot of these radical preachers who have been stirring up these demonstrations in Egypt, the people who went out to demonstrate against the video. How did they know about it? Because satellite television stations funded by Saudi money with radical preachers were broadcasting the film over and over again and telling people to go out and demonstrate on 9/11. So that's Saudi's one hand. On the other hand, this week, the Saudi Grand Mufti, the chief cleric, and the clerics in the government are like this, the chief cleric issued a statement saying that it was anti-Islamic to go out and demonstrate, hurt diplomats, destroy property, and that this video could never hurt the prophet or the religion. which is obvious. If you have a great religion, it's much bigger than some idiotic video. Now, he said all kinds of bad things about the horrible video, but the point of this was, our religion is bigger than this. The religion does not require you to go out and do this. It is anti-Islamic to go out and do this. Clearly, the Saudis are afraid, the government is afraid of what it's unleashed, but that doesn't stop the money flowing. Saudi money is going into Syria and weapons to the worst of the militias. And, you know, we aren't giving anything to the better ones, and we don't even know who they are. But anyway, that's another story. So after Abdullah the Deluge, which the next president will have to deal with.
Hey, thank you very much for your presentation. I thought it was very, very insightful. I want to direct you to China. China, over the next couple of weeks, is going through a major leadership change in the president and prime minister, and the impact of that going into the future, and your thoughts on communist rule going into the future in China, and whether there's a possibility of any type of Arab or an uprising within the Chinese, anywhere in China, that might threaten communist rule in China.
You know, I mean, again, a very important question. I mean, I certainly don't know, and frankly, I don't think that anyone in the U.S. government or U.S. intelligence has any idea, nor does the world, nor probably do most Chinese, including people in their Politburo, what kind of a leader President Xi will be, the next putative president. Because, you know, I mean, first of all, Chinese leaders often change once they come into power. Secondly, we don't know how constrained he will be by leftovers from the old guard. As you may have read, he is somebody who has been in the United States, who was on an exchange. I forget which state it was, Iowa, talks about the friends that he made there. So that could lead you to believe there would be more openness to dealing with the U.S. or not. But the bottom line is, and I'll come to the question of the population, the bottom line is the Chinese military appears to be high, and which is extremely powerful and growing in power over the years, is extremely absorbed with the narrative that the United States is trying to constrain the rise of China as a great power. And, you know, whether that belief, which is very prevalent in China, can be disabused, I don't think the U.S. is trying to constrain China. I do think the United States, and rightly, is trying to work with other Southeast and East Asian countries to avoid a situation where China, a rising China, is overly aggressive, especially because of its need for resources and its desire to control water lanes, underwater resources. Obviously, you can see the problems that can arise from this. Whether U.S. diplomats and the next president can break through this mindset, I can't say. I mean, clearly, you know, Obama tried, he tried engagement, he tried being nice, that didn't work. Now he's trying being tough. I don't know if that's going to work, but as I said, if you play tough, you can't just back down, because then you become an empty suit and the Chinese roll over you. You know, do we want a trade war with China? You know, Romney says he'll declare them a currency manipulator on the first day. I don't think that's going to work either. But when you come to the internal dynamics of China, one thing that I have found very frightening, I mean, I'm not a China expert, but I go there, you know, every couple of years. There is a visceral hatred of Japan inside China, including among young people. Now, you can understand that people who are old enough to, and maybe not many of them are left, but old enough to remember the Second World War, or people who were children then, or people whose grandparents were in that war, you know, the memories are hideous of what Japan did. And as you all know, Japan never properly apologized, although there have been a couple of Japanese prime ministers who half apologized. But, you know, there are issues that have never been resolved. But it has astonished me on occasions when I've sat with Chinese students or Chinese young professionals and the subject of Japan comes up. I've had people say to me, "We hate Japan." And the word hate I've heard repeatedly in different conversations. That's potentially explosive. You've read there's a conflict over a set of islands. You know, whether the U.S. can help mediate that, you know, it's hard to say. But that kind of latent and sometimes open nationalism amongst the Chinese population is a glue that I think can hold them together behind leadership and that leadership can play on in order to cement support. I mean, and just, you know, one other thing, as you may probably have read, there are thousands of small demonstrations all over China at any given time. You have workers in Factory X going on strike. You have villagers in Province Y who are holding a protest. What you don't have is any amalgamation of these many, many protests. I've talked to Chinese labor leaders in exile in Hong Kong, and many of these individual factories, they'll send people to Hong Kong because there are groups there that can operate more openly. But what you find is, A, it's very hard to organize because, as you've seen, any attempt at organization is smashed by the regime. So it's a big country, and if you try to spread out, even if you just stay in your village can get smashed if it's a big protest. So the Chinese are acutely out there to smash anything that grows bigger. Occasionally, you've had Chinese leaders, the provincial head of Guangdong, I think that's where there's a governor who's rising up in the hierarchy who chose, I think his name is Wang Yang, he chose to go to a village where there was a demonstration and negotiate. And that got a lot of attention in the Western media because it was so unusual, mediation instead of smashing. Whether the Chinese government will take that approach, will not foment, but permit the growth of civil society organizations, I can't say. I know on my last trip to China, I was with a small group of journalists, and we met with the Minister of Health, who was not a party member. And it was very interesting because he said that in order to really find out what's going on with HIV/AIDS in the country, he can't get the information from party officials. He has to talk to NGOs. And some of the Chinese NGOs that he talks to, and their leaders have actually been called to come to Beijing, are banned. They can't officially register. They're allowed to operate sub rosa, and then officials in Beijing look to them for information. So you have an ironic situation where there are officials in the government who understand that you need civil society to intermediate because regional, provincial, and local governments are often so corrupt. But they're afraid to legalize civil society because they're afraid that it might get out of hand. Sandra Myers was just in Taiwan, and we were just talking about Taiwan. In Taiwan, the son of Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Ching-kuo, I may have mispronounced, but was a dictator who brought in democracy step by step, village elections, town elections, then democratizing the Kuomintang, his political party. There was a point in the beginning of the 90s where the Chinese allowed village elections, and you had senior people from their Ministry of Civil Administration who were going to Taiwan to study how the Taiwanese raised up village elections until you had a politically democratic system. That was nipped in the bud, and those officials, the guy who was in charge left China and became a fellow, I think he became a fellow at Yale, I'm not sure. Anyway, So the problem is you will have officials who want more openness, but you will have a lot of other people in the establishment who oppose it. And I don't think there is enough pressure from below. I think you have a massive segment of population, young professionals who you might think are the ones who would push for it, who don't. I'm always astonished in having conversations with young professionals and even with students, how they say, we don't want chaos in our country. Things are so much better off than they were for our parents, that we accept some limits. And I often hear this, don't think that we can't see what we want to see on the internet. We know how to jump the great firewall. And the educated people do. They use, there is software that they can get their hands on to go. Actually, it's the software that was developed by the Falun Gong, and it's widely available inside China. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question. I don't think there's going to be a revolution from below, and I think we have no idea if there's going to be change from above yet. I think my time's up.
Yeah.
Oh, I've got more time?
Hannah Arendt once described the period between the two world wars as between the no longer and the not yet. Well, maybe every period is that, actually. But it kind of feels that way in the world. And I wonder if it's inevitable, given the changes, that our power diminishes, and how do we adapt smartly to this situation? I know you've given us some ideas, but say more.
I think that's a critical question too, and let me say the one thing that I feel most strongly about. In this period of the not yet, the United States still has a lot of power. We still are the most powerful economy. We still do project the most military strength. And even though people in the world are bemused by what's happening to us and confused, they're still looking to see, is there life in that beast? And I think it is a mistake and an illusion to think that in this in-between period, it's sufficient to simply try to promote multilateral institutions. Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is the head of the Woodrow Wilson Center at Princeton and was head of policy planning at the State Department and was close to Secretary Clinton, wrote a book, which is very, very hard to read. I read the abbreviated version in Foreign Affairs and could barely get through that. But her thesis, which was very popular in this administration, was that the U.S. was a great power because it was so talented, so capable of networking, and that in the future, power didn't come from the top; it came from networks. That may be very good thesis in academia. But in reality, I think that what we have seen over the last 4 years is that networking is important, but in this period, if somebody doesn't take the lead, the committee will not meet. And I think that it has become so clear. Syria, as I brought up, is the perfect example. Everyone thought, oh, Turkey will do it, because Turkey wants the fall of Assad, so they'll send in their troops, they'll send in their planes. No, they won't. There are all kinds of reasons. If the United States does not try to shape and lead multilateral organizations in the interim, they won't gel, because multilateralism is not the answer by itself. And, the whole idea of broadening the Security Council, frankly, it would just be a huge talk shop and nothing would ever happen. Nothing happens now because of the veto, but even less would happen then. So I think the U.S. has to decide whether it is going to help shape this interim period to the not yet. I think there was a little bit too much reluctance in this administration that it was thought that goodwill, engagement, and multilateralism and networking alone were sufficient. And I think what we've learned is that U.S. leadership is still required, because right now the rest may be rising, but they're not leading. And as a result, there's a lot of anarchy around the globe. And when you have no power, then someone else tries to fill it, the vacuum, which is usually small anarchic groups that can do tremendous damage working between state lines. And I think we can't afford to let that happen. We can't fight back against it everywhere, but I think in critical areas, we still need to lead and can lead if we can make some progress in getting our own house together. Oh, sorry, yes.
Well, for many, many years, the focus of the United States Middle Eastern policy was the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And I get the sense that that's sort of been set aside, perhaps not only in the United States, but also for the Arabs and the other Muslims in the Middle East. Do you have any feeling like that?
It hasn't been set aside. You know, there's a lot of internal storm and drang in the Arab world. So, you know, people are preoccupied with their own problems. But if you go to Egypt, no, it hasn't been set aside. It's still a very hot button issue there. It's an issue that can be played on by Islamist groups. And it's an issue of direct relevance. And Egypt is a country of great importance. We don't know where it's going to go, but it's of direct relevance in Egypt, because now that you have elected governments ruling over countries with no real democratic institutions, which means they have to play to the street, and the street is, you know, very populist, easily aroused, the whole issue of the treaty with Israel comes up. And what you hear on the street is, why should we keep this treaty if Israel won't make peace, you know, won't permit a Palestinian state? So that's number one. Number two, Israel and the United States need Egypt to keep a lid on the Sinai, where it's easy to funnel stuff into Gaza. And, you know, that also leads back to, is there any progress on the Palestinian issue? And while the Morsi government has much bigger problems on its plate, and it knows it, again, the street can easily be aroused. And lastly, you know, just because the status quo is calm, we often assume that it's going to remain calm. You know, I remember before the first Intifada in Israel, nobody expected it, and then suddenly it exploded. Same with the second Intifada. The situation in Israel is inherently unstable. Now, I don't think it's possible to negotiate two states at this moment in history with so much instability in the region. However, what's happening on the West Bank is that the settlement movement is expanding, and it is making it impossible at any future time for there ever to be a solution, because basically the land is being cut up into little chunks. There is no viable state possible anymore. And that is being encouraged by the current Israeli government, which has a vision of a state on only 40% of the West Bank. That's basically a little, that isn't even contiguous land, little cantons linked by tunnels and bridges. You know, if that were possible and the Palestinians accepted it, fine. The problem is, sadly, it isn't going to work. So you are going to have an explosion on the West Bank sooner or later. And Israel is stuck with a huge Palestinian population that it's basically going to have to rule over indefinitely, and in a situation that looks more and more like apartheid. And that is going to cause repercussions in the Arab world. So I think right now things are quiet. You know, the Arab leaders have more than enough problems on their hands, but this will explode again. and it will have repercussions inside Israel. I think eventually there'll be a civil war on the West Bank between settlers and population. And you're going to have, well, anyway, I won't go on. But it's quiet now, but it's not going to last.
I'd like to thank Trudy for opening our eyes to maybe some things that we don't want to see but need to see. And I am deeply grateful to you for doing that, Trudy. Thank you. We'll have a short break and then back here for our next lecture.